Good afternoon. It is Saturday, October 8th. It's 5 o'clock on the East Coast, 3 o'clock in Wyoming. Another exciting episode of Foundations of Development with Professor DeNobili. So let's get started. So we're going to visit our roadmap like we usually do. And this week we're going to look at our learning theories based on the behaviorists Pavlov, Watson, Jones, and Skinner. A little bit of a to-do list. So I had sent out my research survey. One of my assignments that I have to do for my doctorate is a research study, and I sent the survey to you guys. It's optional. It's due by October 10th, so it's due in 2 days. And again, it's optional, but I did say that you can trade in if you do the survey, you could trade it in for a free homework pass. So that's for you. Homework number 2 is due Sunday. I will allow for an extension to Monday due to the holiday. So if you need an extra day, just reach out to me and let me know. Exam 2 will be due on October 23rd. That's in 2 weeks from now, I believe. We're now on the right side of our chart. And today we're going to be looking at Pavlov with classical conditioning, Watson with Little Albert, Mary Cover Jones with her desensitization and deconditioning, and B.F. Skinner with operant conditioning. So here we go. We're going straight on the right side in our nature versus nurture debate. If we remember Locke, he focused on association, repetition, modeling, and rewards. We've been looking at the nature versus Rousseau and the criticality of nature. So Locke was on the nurture side, on the right side, and Rousseau was on the left side, and they were our two extremes. To date, we focused on the nature side. We looked at maturational theory, ethological and evolutionary theory, Werner and Gesell, Montessori, Piaget, and Kohlberg, who were our stage theorists, and this all was part of the organismic model. We paused and looked at Bandura and intersectionalism between the two, and now we're shifting to the far right on our scale. To appreciate intersectionism, we need to know about how learning is impacted by outside forces, also known as nurture, and looking at man as a machine, or the mechanismic model of learning. So here we go. I like looking at these theorists. This is like our second garage band. Our first garage band were the ethologists. These are our behaviorists. Pavlov, Watson, Jones, and Skinner, all going from left to right. If this was a real rock band, I think they would play awesome music. So here we go. Our first behaviorist is Pavlov, classical conditioning. When you get a chance, check out this clip from The Office. This is a classic conditioning moment from the Office. You'll get a kick out of it, and pretty much it's the whole part of Pavlov in a nutshell. So in less than a minute, you basically learn everything you need to know about Pavlov. So Pavlov's work is classical conditioning. If you think of in terms like it's the first form of conditioning. I just want to go through the overview of it. You have the unconditioned stimulus, the unconditioned reflex, the conditioned stimulus, and the conditioned reflex. So using the clip from The Office as the model here, the unconditioned stimulus is the mere presentation of food. So if somebody offers you an Altoid, let's say, uh, most likely you're going to take it and you're going to want it, especially if you think you have bad breath. All right. The unconditioned reflex is taking it, wanting it. Now, a conditioned stimulus is something that is introduced coinciding with the unconditioned stimulus. So, for example, in the office clip, Jim offers Dwight an Altoid every time the window sound occurs. And so he is conditioning Dwight to want an Altoid whenever the Windows sound occurs in their office. And by doing this, the conditioned reflex for Dwight is thrusting out his hand every time he's offered an Altoid. Now, as time goes on, unconsciously, what Jim is doing to Dwight is that later on in the clip, he plays the sound, but does not offer the Altoid. And all of a sudden, Dwight just thrusts out his hand uncontrollably. And Jim is like, "What are you doing?" I don't know, because this is one of Jim's pranks on Dwight. And then Dwight goes, "I don't know, but all of a sudden I feel like I have bad breath." Obviously, it's all in good comedy, it's all in good fun, but the whole point is that that is a Pavlovian response. So don't worry so much about the US, the UR, the CS, the CR. Get the big concept. What is classic conditioning and what is the big concept? Overall, what Pavlov showed is that you can train behavior. You can modify behavior by training it. In addition, you'll need to know these terms, but there's extinction, stimulus generalization, discrimination, and higher order conditioning. So, for example, in the office example, if Jim doesn't offer Dwight an Altoid every single time the Windows sound comes on, it will eventually go away. It'll eventually, because that's not a natural response for Dwight. So eventually that will go away. Although that you might see what's called like spontaneous resurrection every so often, where all of a sudden, some time will pass and he'll be like, I feel like I want an Altoid right now. There is stimulus generalization when the stimulus generalizes to something else, but largely similar. So, for example, it may not be the Windows sound, but Dwight might respond every time he hears a sound similar to the Windows sound. He might want an Altoid every time he sees it. Discrimination occurs when the individual can tell the difference between one stimuli and another nearly similar stimuli. This is important, for example, in school. We tend to train students where to go from class to class using a bell system. So the students need to know that every time they hear a bell, it doesn't necessarily mean they move. The bells are a bit of a language within the school to let them know. So, for example, you have the first bell to tell you when the last period ended. Then you have the transition between periods, and then you have a second bell to let you know when the next period has begun. There may be a bell for lunchtime. There may be a bell for after school. Now, if the fire bell rings, the fire alarm, the fire bell rings, which is a similar sound, but it's clearly different. it it's a language. It lets the students know where they need to be. So if they hear the fire alarm, even though it's similar to the other bells, they need to know that's a different message. We need to leave. So that's discrimination. And then you have higher order conditioning, which is just a refinement of that discrimination. Um, Locke versus Pavlov. So knowledge is based on association, said Locke, and remember Piaget's notion of associativity. But Locke did not experiment as did Pavlov. So what Pavlov did was basically brought Locke's work into the lab. That's basically what Pavlov did. Pavlov's biggest contribution was how he employed the scientific method. I remember what the scientific method is. You have a hypothesis, you test it, you know, all of that. He did research. Locke was just basically basing it on, I guess you could say, common sense, but he doesn't use it. He did Locke didn't do scientific experiments. Pavlov is one of those giants whose shoulders we stand on. There's a lot of Pavlov that we've moved on from, but like I said, as the school bells, like Pavlov still applies, but we have moved on in that sense. John Watson took Pavlov to higher heights. Inspiring man for he's an aspiring man for some of us. He says, I was lazy, somewhat insubordinate, and so far as I know, I never made a passing grade. So in a way, it's kind of like if you're an underachiever, you might be able to sort of to amazing heights. Hold on one second. I need to pause. I need to pause the recording. Hey everyone, I'm sorry for that pause. If you may notice, my background looks a little bit different than what you usually see. One of my side gigs is house sitting. I heard scratching at the back door. It's one of the dogs that I'm pet sitting at the house that I'm at. So I apologize for that. If you hear sounds in the background, little scurrying, that's the dogs for you. So let's pick up where we left off with John Watson. He's known as the original behavioralist. The goal of psychology should be the prediction and control of behavior. He did not believe in looking inward. He did not believe in looking at nature. He said everything has to be observable. You cannot observe cognition. You cannot observe the thinking process. So for Watson, it had to be something that is observable. And the only thing we can modify, control, and observe is behavior. Here's what happened to Watson. He had a relationship with one of his lab assistants, which was not his wife. And so he was fired from his job and he lost his prestigious academic job and went on to be a clerk at Macy's. What's interesting is that probably allowed him to give him time to, which actually made him famous, was writing different books on babies, which we'll get to in a second. But his most famous experiment was on little Albert, which we found out later on that the name was Douglas Moretti. It was questionable ethics because Douglas was conditioned to fear white fuzzy things, but by the time before the experiment was actually able to be finished, they were never able to decondition little Albert, little Douglas. I think the dogs need to be let out. Let me check to see if they're okay. Hold on one second. So I had fed the dogs and they needed to be let out again. So I apologize. So Douglas was conditioned to fear fuzzy things. but Watson never had the opportunity to decondition him. And it turned out that Moretti died at the age of 6 of hydrocephalus, a medical condition in which fluid builds up inside the skull, um, which, as far as we know, was had nothing to do with the Watson's experiments, but it's kind of a little interesting. Um, watch the video on the baby Albert experiments on YouTube, and the link is provided there. Watson hands off his work to Mary Cover Jones. She'll elaborate on the idea of conditioned reflexes, more importantly, on the idea of deconditioning, because he was never able to. She will give us the approaches known as systemic desensitization and behavior modification. We'll cover Jones in a moment, but let's go back to Watson for a second. So Watson is known as the original baby doc. He recommended the babies be placed on rigid schedules and that parents should refrain from hugging, kissing, or caressing their babies. We already learned with Ainsworth that that doesn't work. So it was somewhat debunked. But Watson put child rearing squarely in the realm of scientific inquiry. The whole point of a lot of these scientists on the behaviorist side is that they took what was first seen as common sense and they started applying it to the scientific method. Much like when we see with Darwin and Gazelle and all of them, like they took something that was assumed to be true, or maybe not assumed, like with Darwin with evolution. Now, evolution wasn't assumed to be true, and really brought it into the scientific method. Later research is fine-tuned what Watson found. We see it correlated with Piaget's notion of primary circulation reactions and the association of sensory motor activity with reward. So some practical applications of Watson. What's his relevance to education? There's not many except for research ethics because of what he did to little baby Albert. In fact, more will have to do with what Mary Cover Jones discovered, sensitization and desensitization. Watson, nevertheless, teaches us that approaching what we know will be a period of disequilibrium. Teachers can sensitize, they can move students out of their comfort zone in baby steps. And if there's great pushback from the students, we can desensitize and move them back to their comfort zone. In a way, like part of but again, this has to do with behavior. But there's behavior modification is sometimes relevant, and we'll see later on with Skinner. But the point is that however you're manipulating the environment, and I'm not talking about the morality of manipulating the environment. I'm going to pause here and say I personally don't believe that you should be manipulating the environment. However, pause back on. If you're going to manipulate the environment, ethically, you need to manipulate it back. If you're going to modify a certain behavior, or try to modify a certain behavior, you need to desensitize and move back as much as possible. But also, the whole point is that you're doing it in baby steps for whatever that behavior modification may be. And in some cases, behavior modification is appropriate, and we'll see as we move on. Let's spend a moment on research ethics. Pavlov worked with dogs. As we know now, dogs have feelings. We know that they have feelings. We'd rather do no harm. We'd rather that no harm come to them. Animal research is a little, just as much as human research is controversial. I mean, we kill thousands of rats and mice every day in the interest of science. I participated in mouse research when I was in high school. So I know the whole process of, how animals are treated in labs. very controversial. Watson and little Albert. Years later, upon review, it was clear that the experiment was ethically flawed. There was no consent, there was no deconditioning or reconditioning, and therefore harm was done to little Albert. He was never deconditioned to no longer fear white, fuzzy things for the rest of his short life. And if you want a real world perspective, there is a documentary called Three Identical Strangers. And that little note by Aspen Black, that's from Dr. Russo. I forgot to take that little note out there, but apparently Aspen Black had recommended that. Let's move on to the Belmont Report in the 1970s. All you really need to know about the Belmont Report is that as a result of a lot of factors, including Pavlov and especially Watson, but it also has its roots in Nazi Germany research, as well as the Stanford prison experiment. There was a realization, especially in the United States, that we need a set of standards for all research to be done. The set of standards is non-maleficence, to do no harm, to allow individuals to withdraw from an experiment at any point. You should not be forcing participants to participate in an experiment at any point if they choose not to. They have their own autonomy and agency. Benefits need to be distributed fairly among participants. They need to be debriefed, and communication needs to be opened. If you're conditioning their behavior, they need to be reconditioned back. You need to obtain consent and be honest. You need to inform the authorities, and you need to preserve anonymity and confidentiality. As an example for all of this, I had to follow these for the research survey that I sent out to you. I had to get informed consent from any of you that participated or will participate in the next few days. I had to let you know the level of risk involved, how I was going to handle any of the information that you gave me. I had to inform the review board at the University of Wyoming. And yeah, so these standards, these rules of research ethics continue to this day as we move forward. Mary Cover Jones is known as the mother of behavior therapy. She's one of our few female theorists that we learn about. She further elaborated on the conditioned reflex, especially deconditioning. She gave us the approaches known as systemic desensitization and behavior modification. So, for example, if you go to behavioral therapy, let's say you have the fear of flying, you will have a therapist who will take you through baby steps to overcome your fear of flying, because fear comes out, even though fear is an emotion, fear is internal. Just as Watson would say, we have to observe the behavior. So even though fear is internal, fear is it affects our behavior as human beings. So Mary Cover Jones will talk about, from a behavioral modification therapy is about modifying the behavior in baby steps. So if there's a fear of flying, you'll first start with talking about it. In like traditional therapy, you'll talk about your fear of flying, where it originated from, and then the next step would be like, let's go to the airport and let's see how you feel when we go to the airport. So you go to the airport, and like your heart may start racing when you go to the airport. Okay, that's all we got to do today. All we want to do is set foot at the airport, and then let's go out on the tarmac at the airport. Okay, good. Well, let's go on a plane. Let's sit on a plane. Okay, good. Well, now the next time you go, let's see if we can get a small plane, and let's taxi on the runway. Let's taxi on the runway. We're not going to fly. We're going to taxi on the runway. And little by little, you face your fear, as the classic sentence goes, and eventually the hope is that as time goes on, the individual overcomes their fear of flying. Now, a lot of you know that I'm a Frankel person. This is just a side note. Frankel talks about dereflection and behavior modulation. Notice the difference in terms. Frankel did not believe in, he's not a behaviorist. He did not believe in modifying behavior because he felt that you should not be manipulating the environment. But there is an idea by using modulation is that the behavior does change over time, but it comes from the will of the individual. The individual leads it, not the therapist. The therapist does not lead it. Dereflection, as the name replies, it's to deflect or to dereflect um, from from whatever it is, the behavior that is in front of you, and typically it's using humor. So typically, let's say it's a fear of spiders. So Frankel would say, here's what I want you to do. I want you to think of the worst case scenario. We're going to put you in a pit of spiders. Every time you have a fear of spiders, just say, I want to be put in a pit of spiders, and I want spiders to walk all over me. I want them to walk all over me. I want to be up to my. And the point is that using that humor might help. And studies have shown of using dereflection that it does. That's just a side note that I wanted to add. Not going to be tested on it, but anything about Frankel in this sense, you're not going to be tested on. But I just want to let you know that that's out there. That it's similar to behavior modification, but it's slightly different. Slightly different than behavior modification. So relevance. So students, particularly young children, will be sensitized to certain stimuli: loud noises, yelling, screaming, bad tastes, smells. Our job is not to judge or roll our eyes. Instead, we must remember Jones's work and engage in desensitizing, excuse me. So, and this is through the process of successive approximations. So, for example, if there are negative situations where students have been sensitized to fear certain stimuli, we can, as teachers, desensitize them to it, as long as it's for the benefit of the child. Behavior modification was her other contribution. Here, as a teacher or any other kind of professional, you are engaging in modeling different behaviors and the positive consequences. Again, they have to be positive consequences. Your job as a teacher is not to desensitize them to anything. And it's not saying that, like, let's desensitize them to loud noises and yelling and screaming. It's more in the sense of increasing positive behaviors that will benefit the child moving forward. If loud noises causes a child to freeze, that's not good when the fire alarm goes off. If the child freezes during a fire drill, or in the worst case scenario, during an actual fire and the fire alarm goes off and they freeze in place, that's not good. That child needs to be desensitized to the loud noise. That's what I'm talking about as a positive consequence, and not simply saying that, oh, we got to just change their behavior to what we want. No, that's not what I'm saying here. Just to clarify that. All right, which brings us to Skinner. You should know the schedules of reinforcement. You will be tested on the schedules of reinforcement. This is him with his hair combed, and then this is him with his hair not combed. There we go. And he is known as the father of behavioral analysis. Here is the Big Bang Theory. I forgot to, it wasn't posted in announcements. I That's the note from Dr. Russo. But there is a scene from The Big Bang Theory where they reference Skinner. He contributed to three branches of what we now call behavioralism: experimental analysis of behavior, radical behavioralism, or conceptual behavioralism. Actually, no, it's a conceptual science. Sorry, and applied behavior analysis. From this, we get reinforcement schedules. ABA is also closely related to autism education. Just to let you know, if anyone's interested in special education, especially the education of individuals with autism, you usually need to get ABA trained. And the last one, the ABA training, is what we focus on in this class. Okay, so reinforcement schedule is the regularity with which we provide reinforcement. That schedule depends on the actual behavior we ultimately want and whether we wish to build it, strengthen it, or maintain it. Fixed schedules are used to build and strengthen behavior, but at some point, variable schedules take over. Variable schedules are meant to further build and maintain behavior. Operant is intended to mean how behavior modification affects different operating modes of the individual. So there's two general categories: the inverse schedules, where we have reinforcement is given after a certain amount of time has passed. As we said, there's fixed and variable. Fixed is when reinforcement is presented after a fixed amount of time, and variable is when the reinforcement is administered unpredictably to the student but is known by the teacher. Reinforcement could also be delivered on a random basis, unpredictable to everyone involved. Ratio schedules are when reinforcement is given after a certain number of responses that have been delivered by the student. A fixed ratio is when the reinforcement is presented after each completion of a designated number of responses, always the same number. So after 5 questions, you can go and play with your Legos. So you answer 5 questions, you play with your Legos. You answer questions 6 through 10, you play with your Legos. A variable ratio is when the instances of reinforcement is variable but based on certain rules. So you can play with your Legos. After you finish 5 to 10 questions, or you could play with your Legos after you answer all of your questions over 2 to 3 days of classwork. So you give, there is a variable ratio, but it's based on certain rules. Sorry, guys, got to pause it one more time. Those dogs need to come inside. And we're back. So here are some examples here. The next few slides will give you examples I've made up to try and explain each of the schedules. As you hear about them, consider how they operant in your own lives, and through storytelling. So Dr. Russo was in business management. I wanted to get this out to you as quickly as I could because it was already later in the week, so I did not go through this particular slide, so I apologize. But I can tell you as a teacher, some of it applies here as well. As a teacher, you'll see operant conditioning. I think I added that slide later on. But it's about the behavior you want as a teacher. That's why it's a little bit controversial in the big picture. I'm not saying like people are having debates about it all the time or that it's in the news. Oh my God, look at that operant conditioning going on at that school. Operant conditioning happens at every school, but it is controversial because it's the behavior the teacher wants. You're controlling it. That's why it's on the nurture side of the scale. Presenting a reinforcement after a fixed, always the same amount of time passes. So for example, this is what Dr. Russo is talking about. You receive a paycheck just for showing up. It happens every 2 weeks or maybe once a month. That's a fixed time schedule. If you have a job, any of you who have a job know this. The behavior that your employer wants is for you to show up and for you to do your job. And your reward is your paycheck. So they give it on a fixed ratio. Could you imagine? Could you imagine if it was variable? It just happened haphazardly. The issue with that from a economic point of view is that you would never know when you would get your paycheck. Maybe you get your paycheck every first it was the second Friday, then it would be 4 weeks from then. And two reasons why it's on a fixed schedule is that a company can plan out their finances. So it's just practical that way. You know when you can pay your bills on time. It just makes sense. So doing my job to some minimum level of performance and receiving a paycheck monthly, checking for the mail lady every day at 9:30, a college course where there are exams every 3 weeks, rain or shine. There's a certain behavior that we want, and it happens on a fixed schedule. Ratios are when reinforcement is given after a certain number of proper responses have occurred. So it's always the same number, hence the fixed ratio. So I gave a poor example earlier. It wouldn't be answering every 5 questions, but it would be answer every time you answer 5 questions correctly. Giving a child a piece of candy every 3rd time she picks up all of her toys and puts them away. Any of you who are parents and children have chores, they get rewards for doing certain chores. If you're a car salesperson, getting paid a commission after selling 5 cars. Awarding an elementary student a prize after reading 10 books. If you're a piece worker in a factory and you get paid some amount of money for having built 3 widgets correctly. So think of ratios in an employer sense, and they're like, these are bonuses. You do certain behaviors and you will get a bonus. That's a ratio schedule. Variable interval is when the reinforcement is administered unpredictably to the person, but is known to the teacher or boss or supervisor. Reinforcement could also be delivered on a random basis to everyone. This is a good time to remind you that you can and should use all 4 schedules all the time. So Dr. Russo did it as management. I also do it as a teacher. Unpredictable reinforcement occurs after a random amount of time, a random variable. So for example, I may, checking your cell phone for text messages is a perfect example. You don't know when you will be rewarded with a message, but you continue to check until you do. That's random. Random. A parent attending to the cries of a child. Parents will not typically attend to a child every time it cries. Parents learn to let the child fuss for a period of time before attending to them. This is random. It's variable. It's variable when they do it. Variable ratio is when reinforcement is variable but based on rules. This is perhaps the hardest one to grasp. Think here of pop quizzes. You don't know when they might happen, but you do know they will happen at some point. And when they do, they will afford you the opportunity to earn a set number of points based on rules set forth on a syllabus. And the thing to remember as a teacher is that I am hoping to shape behavior. What behavior? Studying. I do this in my high school classes. Guys, we're going to be reading. If I'm noticing you're not reading in class, I'm going to throw out a random pop quiz because I want them to read more. And that's why the random pop quiz sometimes helps with that behavior, if that's the behavior I want. Think of also the slot machine. It will pay out after a number of times. You just don't know what that number is. You do know the reward. It's usually shown at the top of the machine. 3 cherries will get you $10. Another one is poker. You do not win every time you play, but you must play in order to win. Just like the lottery. It's random about when it actually occurs, or at least we think it's random. Because I don't know. I've played slot machines before. I hate playing slot machines because I'll play and play and play and play, and then I'll leave, and the next person who gets on wins the jackpot. I'm like, are you kidding me? That is unfair. But anyway, that was me complaining for a moment. Skinner was criticized because he examined only overt behavior. He ignored internal mental states. If we cannot see them, we cannot study them. He saw internal mental states as a weaker, more covert form of behavior. But they do exist. We do know this, and we'll see this when we talk about Freud later on. Operant conditioning lends itself to authoritarian practice. Many conditioning efforts are subliminal, unknown to the person, benign most of the time. Subliminal priming is the buzz phrase. Advertisers do it best. Some examples would include sexual pictures in advertisements that have nothing to do with sex. So, for example, car commercials. Some car commercials will have very beautiful women in them because sex sells, and a guy may think, well, if I buy this car, I'm going to get more women. I need to pause one more time, guys. I am sorry. The other dog finally decided that he wanted to come back. So that was the second dog. The second dog's name is Darwin. I find that very funny. Darwin. One of our theorists. Darwin. Oh, Darwin. I love Darwin so much. First night, I lost him in the backyard. I'll tell you that story another time. But here we go, guys. I am switching up the modules. Don't be alarmed. Switching up the modules. So next week, module 8 will be Noam Chomsky. Chapter 16. Those are the page numbers. The following week, we're going to go to Vygotsky. Chapter 10. Module 10 will be Albert Bandura. Chapter 9. We'll come to Freud first week in November. Then we're doing 2 weeks of Erik Erikson. We're not doing 2 weeks because he's that important. It's just how the course ended up. So we're doing 2 weeks of Erik Erikson from November 7th to the 20th. I also think it's because it's a very long chapter. I think that's the other reason why we're doing 2 weeks of it, because it's a very long chapter. Then we're going to come to Carl Jung after the Thanksgiving break. Then December 15th, we're going to have the flex week. I'm thinking I want to do an extra credit module for anyone who wants to earn some extra credit at the end of the course. I'm thinking of interviewing one of my my professors that I had. That's it. That's all I want to say. There won't be a reading for that week. It'll be an optional module for you to do. That'll be like catch-up work week. I'll also have the test guide for the final. Although I'm switching up the module lineup, it doesn't change any of the assignments. It doesn't change any of the times for the exams. None of that changes. It's just changing the order in which that we're doing it. Next week is Noam Chomsky. I think he's the only theorist that's still alive. He's also very political. He'll come out every so often to make some political statements. He's a very interesting guy. So here we go, the to-do list. My research survey, if you're still interested, it'll be open until October 10th, because then I got to do the data analysis. Yay me. Homework number 2 is due Sunday. I will allow an extension to Monday for the holiday. If you want to use the research survey as your homework too, you could do that. Some of you owe me work. You could also apply it to work that you already owe me. That works too. It's the free homework pass that you get with doing the survey. I will be reaching out to whoever has done the survey, maybe tonight or tomorrow, to see if you want to what you want to apply your survey to. What you cannot apply the survey to is exams, and you cannot apply it to the final reflection paper. You can apply it to any other assignment. The exam 2 study guide is coming out soon, and exam 2 will be due October 23rd. There we go. I think that's it, guys. We only had to pause a couple of times. Very happy about that. All right. Enjoy the rest of your evening. It is now 6 o'clock. I hope it didn't take me a whole hour to do it. I know we paused a few times, but there we go. Have a good night. Goodbye.